I would love for both of you to introduce yourselves and share a little bit about what you do. Liz, let's start with you.
Thanks, Ann. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm the COO of Hello Sunshine, a media company founded by Reese Witherspoon about 6 years ago, and also have the pleasure of being the chair of the GLAAD's board of directors, working really closely with Sarah Kate Ellis, GLAAD's president and CEO, along with the incredible team at that organization, really focused on accelerating acceptance for the LGBTQ+ community.
Thank you. And Valeria?
I'm the global head of DEI client solutions. That means at Kantar we use data to further understanding of people and inspire growth. And that is my purpose, to help people better understand individuals and communities like LGBTQ+ with more data, more insight about who they really are. That is the key to further empathy and understanding.
We're here in Cannes in June during Pride Month. It's a special time as we bring the marketing and advertising industry together, but with also the backdrop of Pride. There's also a lot going on in the LGBTQ community right now. So it is so important that we are here together to have this conversation. There is some stats that I want to start with sharing that I think are really important as we really think about what is happening in specifically the marketing industry. In LinkedIn's newly launched B2B marketing benchmark report, we found out that 1/3 of companies have no official capacity focusing on DEI. And half of the respondents said that DEI was very important to them personally, but they're not seeing that representation in their company as this being a focus. What are your thoughts on that? We'll start with you, Liz.
You know, I think what's interesting is if you were to say to them to reach out to their employee base, for example, I think you'll hear a very different story in terms of the importance of DEI to each of those folks as individuals, right? And I think additionally as well, it's about how do we sort of convene and spark those conversations around these issues so you hear not only from your employees and your consumers, right? And so I understand that there are clearly challenges and concerns. We're seeing some of that today with backlash when folks do sort of step out in ways where they're slightly unsure, slightly tentatively around it. So for us at GLAAD, it's really about how can we start the conversation and help partner with brands to sort of wade out into these somewhat choppy or daunting waters more effectively.
Valeria, what are your thoughts?
Yes, there's obviously a disconnect between what people are telling us they want from brands and what is the reality within organizations, within brands. And we need to reconcile that, especially for younger generations. For these, obviously if you look at total numbers, it's one story. But when you start to sparse out that information and data and look at what younger people, Gen Zers really expect from brands, that's a huge disconnect. And much of the reason for that, I believe, is out of fear. There's a lot of fear out there about participating in things like Pride 2023. But let's face it, we are paralyzed by very vocal minorities, but that's not the sentiment of the general, sensible majority. And that is what the data tells us, that for most people, there's not just acceptance of LGBTQ+, there's a need to see them well represented in content, in advertising, in life in general.
Just to piggyback on what Valeria just shared, our data shows that a supermajority of non-LGBTQ folks, I think it's in the magnitude of 85–90%, believe in equal rights for LGBTQ people and believe they should be able to live a life without discrimination.
And how is that then being represented or not in advertising? Because I think you both have some really interesting and saddening stats on on how the LGBT community is actually being represented in ads. Tell me about those numbers.
Sure. GLAAD recently launched an advertising visibility index. It's our first annual index. And what we found, the approach, first of all, to this study was to look at over 400 ads, I believe it's 430 on television. These were ads from the top 10 advertisers. What we found in terms of LGBTQ representation and inclusion in those ads, 3% of those ads, so 14 ads, featured the LGBTQ community.
Wow.
And if you were to parse it a little bit further, you'd see what that represents in terms of screen time was only 1.5%, right? And then the one that was most jarring to me was of that 3%, 70% of that featured LGBTQ celebrities, right? So if you're talking about there's visibility and there's real representation of folks in the community as part of the narrative and storytelling versus just kind of casting or representation, both important, but what I believe consumers really want to see are themselves, their friends, folks they know represented.
What does that do for the LGBT community when they don't see themselves represented in advertising? I mean, when you 14 ads, I mean, that's just, it's, as a human being, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So what does that actually mean for the community? Valeria?
Well, first, it denies your existence, your full identity. And for a lot of subgroups within this community, that puts them at risk. Because a lot of people learn about these groups from what they see in media and advertising. A lot of people, especially older generations, they don't know a trans person. They don't know someone who's non-binary or pansexual. So what do they learn? They learn from those associations, news, content, and advertising on TV. So if that doesn't bring them a human and real story, and as Liz is telling, this visibility study we did together, if that is not there, what are they going to learn about? And again, celebrities are wonderful, but they are not real, everyday people who go about their lives, who have to go to work, who have families, who have a partner, and who deal with discrimination on a daily basis. And that discrimination is real. We just at Kantar conducted a study on brand inclusion, and what we found is that there's a huge proportion of the population, and specifically LGBTQ+, that experiences discrimination in many different instances. Sometimes when in touch with a brand, when they are shopping, when they are in social media, when they are applying for a job. And what is so interesting is we also asked who is well represented. Those who are never well represented are the ones that experience the most discrimination. So again, advertising has so much power to bring these people to life, to show their humanity. And I think that is a huge miss.
To build on what Valeria was saying, all of that, I think what we have seen is the power for media to change hearts and mind and culture and change how each of us can walk through our lives as a result of that. Obviously, GLAAD has been focused for a long time with our sort of studio responsibility index for over a decade, working with Hollywood on this, film studios for over 2 decades with where we are in television, working on TV. And I think it was Biden himself who said many years ago, what Will and Grace did for gay marriage is immeasurable. And so when you compare these statistics to our representation in the world, 7% of adults identify as LGBTQ. You look at millennials, it's up to 11%, right? If you look at Gen Z, that number goes as high as 20%, which we even said we think is a little bit of a low number based on some of the others that research has shown. But even beyond that, when you think about, those are folks who identify as LGBTQ, think about allies, right? Think about the number of parents who have an LGBTQ child. Those folks are also looking for brands to step up and show and represent their families in ways that really reflect their experience.
I spend a lot of time talking to marketers, CMOs, often in off-the-record conversations. And one of the topics that keeps coming up, particularly in the last 6 months or so, is real concern over how to market with this polarized environment that we're living in right now. You mentioned earlier that it's that small minority that has a very, very loud voice right now. What can the marketing and advertising community do to change these numbers? How can they bring more representation into their advertising in a really meaningful way to get us to, 5-6% a year from now?
Well, I think our hope is that with this study, it will really sort of spark that conversation around it. And I think it's really important to approach it with authenticity and intention, because I think that's often when we see it go a little bit sideways, right? There's not alignment within the organization from sort of marketing up to the very top of the C-suite. There's not alignment with the brand and the brand values and how is that core. And I think one of the challenges is that audiences are more skeptical than ever in some ways and can really sniff out that inauthenticity or cynicism a mile away. So I think that approaching it with a ton of intention, partnering with organizations like GLAAD, we work with over 250 brands, often very quietly behind the scenes, on how to help craft the stories, how to incorporate different types of talent into that. And then also looking inside of your organization, finally. Again, tapping into ERGs and other folks like that to help really craft the most sort of authentic messaging. Take your time, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what's really, really important. If you're not ready, don't do it. But, I think it is of the utmost importance from both a real business perspective, obviously, as well as we're saying, it's just the right thing to do.
I would like to build on what Liz is saying, because she's so right. So many brands don't have an intentional, authentic DEI strategy that aligns with who they are as a brand. What is their purpose? What is their values? And when there is no alignment, that's when you see the cracks. At the first sign of backlash, what we see is, let's pull down, get down, let's shut off all media communications, and that is exactly the opposite of what they should be doing. What we see is that when there is alignment, when there is a good communication that comes throughout the organization, from senior leadership to those in the ERGs who feel confident because it's also who they are, then the results are different. And it needs to be also backed with action, right? Because advertising is wonderful, but in 30 seconds, you can't do magic. It has to reflect what the organization is doing for the community. So tying things together, I think, is key.
And there's one other thing I'd mention too, is that as loud as those voices are, which again is a really, really small minority, I think the thing that we're missing are the brands who are confronted by these bullies, and frequently I think, terrorist is actually a more apt word given some of the actions that some of these groups have taken. When we see brands that have been bullied and have stood firm, they've backed off, right? And I think there are brands that we should be talking about, like Nike, like Walmart, like Kohl's, like North Face, who did stand firm.
Yeah.
And, back down, and it was great. The bullies backed down, and those campaigns continued successfully. So I feel like we're spending a lot of time talking about sort of the negative outcome,
right,
and not really highlighting, hey, this is the playbook to handle that successfully.
Yeah, Liz is so right, because what makes the headline obviously is the loud story, but there are so many great brands that are inspiring, and that are doing great work for LGBTQ plus communities, and they are not getting those headlines.
What's an example? I would love if you could pick one example of a brand.
I have a favorite, but it's a little biased.
That's all right. Share it, please.
So I have a transgender child. So for me, everything to do with supporting transgender people and LGBTQ plus families is really, really important. One of my favorite campaigns was from Oreo, And it was not this Pride, it was last Pride. They had the Proud Parent campaign, which basically, I felt seen for the first time, and I think a lot of families felt that way. And of course, they got, an organization, very conservative organization in the US, the 1 Million Moms, threatening with boycotts. Of course, it's Oreo, it's an iconic American brand, but basically they responded with silence. They avoided, when someone is a bully, you can do a few things. You can confront, you can ignore. They choose to ignore it. They kept going. They had their special edition cookies. They had all these activations for families to share their stories, and it was so powerful. So sometimes is not responding. In other cases is doubling the message or responding with love. But there are ways to deal with this.
Thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
Do you have an example, Liz, of a brand that really...
Yeah, I think there are two that come to mind, quick examples. One that I just find to be so fun, but also really meaningful, and that's sort of Skittles and the campaign that they do during Pride Month, which is really sort of giving the rainbow back to the LGBTQ community. I think that's really special. Another one I'd highlight is MasterCard. I think MasterCard was a real innovator in allowing transgender folks to have a credit card with their chosen name. And you cannot understate how critical financial freedom is. So I think that's one that's really meaningful to me.
What is so poignant about both of your examples, with Oreo, with MasterCard, they're both about being seen. And, everyone deserves to be seen for who they are. But as we've also talked about, since we're here in Cannes talking about advertising and marketing, is that it's also good for these brands for their business. I want to wrap up with one last question, because this is a heavy topic. What is one thing, as we look ahead to the future, that gives you the most hope for the LGBT community and for the work that the two of you and so many others are doing to create a more inclusive advertising environment? Valeria, we'll start with you.
Well, what you said about, the commercial side of things, this is a community that is growing so much in population because more people feel free to express their true identity, but it's also growing in buying power. We estimate at Kantar that about 1.5 trillion buying power that continues to grow just in the US. And it has so much cultural influence. So my hope is that advertisers and marketers will recognize that aside from the social responsibility of brands, there's a commercial opportunity. And closing that consumer inclusion gap will lead to more visibility and better representation that will be integrated, normalized. There will be no one, doing some sort of scandal because they see a gay couple or a family with same-sex parents. That will be accepted, welcomed, valued, and people will be able to live their lives without feeling fear.
I feel exactly the same way, and I'm just going to build on that point. I think when $1.5 trillion, really meaningful, grow from there and think about the number of folks who have children who are part of the LGBTQ community. How large is that spending power? Not only is the younger generation growing, but I just love the way they speak out in ways that they are unafraid. Sometimes wish I were in that same way. But I think they're going to let their employers know, and they're going to vote with their feet too. And so I think that sort of the mandate, the imperative is there from a business perspective, right? So that's what gives me a lot of hope. I think the conversation that we're having now is critical. If we weren't all talking about what had happened, if we all just sort of swept it under the rug, that would be really concerning, right?
Well, the two of you give me a lot of hope. Thank you so much for being here, for sharing your stories, your perspective. And I know that together we can all make the advertising industry a more inclusive, better place. And thank all of you in our audience for joining us here in the LinkedIn Collective Studio.